At 1:23 in the morning, an explosion rips through the quiet night in Ukraine, 50 miles north of the capital, Kiev. Chernobyl Reactor 4 has detonated, releasing 400 times the radiation as the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. While many videos discuss the scientific cause and impacts of the Chernobyl incident, I found that very few go into detail on the stories of the individuals involved. In this video, I will aim to cover both the scientific causes of the incident as well as the heroic actions and mistakes made by members who were present at the time. The shift leader of Reactor Unit 4 checks the time. 5 more minutes before the test begins. He sits with his team of operators in the control room, located below ground. They are preparing to test the safety of Chernobyl Reactor 4 in the event of a power failure. So far, everything seems fine. Nuclear reactors work by using radioactive fuel to generate heat. This heat then converts water into steam, which is used to spin a turbine, outputting electricity. Chernobyl Reactor 4 was a Soviet RMBK reactor. Unlike Western reactors, which slow down the reaction as temperature rises, increasing the temperature in an RMBK reactor causes the nuclear reaction to speed up. This in turn increases the temperature, which then further increases the reaction speed, creating a feedback loop that can quickly get out of control. This is inherently an unsafe design, and will factor into the tragedy that is soon to follow. In order to prevent the core from overheating, 2 methods are used. First, control rods are raised or lowered to control the power output of the core. When lowered, they absorb neutrons, which slow down the rate of reaction. The second method is water, which is pumped throughout the core to act as a coolant. In the event of a power failure, the reactors of Chernobyl are equipped with 3 backup diesel generators to keep the water pumps running. But it takes 1.5 minutes before the generators reach full power. During this 1.5 minute gap, the core is at risk of overheating. Chernobyl scientists had theorized that the residual momentum of the steam turbines may be just enough to power the water pumps during the 1.5 minute gap, giving enough time for the emergency generators to kick in. Figuring out whether this is possible is the subject of the upcoming experiment. At 1 o'clock in the morning, the shift leader gives the go-ahead for his team to begin powering down the reactor. Up until now, the reactor has been running at full power following normal operation. Slowly, the operators begin to reduce the power of Reactor 4. At around 2 o'clock p.m., the emergency core cooling system is switched off. By this time, the nuclear reactor is running at about 50% power. Under the normal procedures for the test, the reactor would have then been reduced to around 30%. However, around this time, Soviet authorities paused the shutdown procedure because there's a demand for additional power on the power grid. Instead of shutting down, the reactor is held at 50% for another 9 hours. During this time, the reactor begins to undergo an effect known as xenon poisoning. When uranium-235 splits during fission, one of the resulting products is an unstable iodine-135, which further decays into xenon-135. Xenon-135 is great at absorbing neutrons, and thus has the effect of slowing down a nuclear reaction. Under normal operational conditions, there are enough neutrons in the reaction to help counteract a buildup of Xenon-135. But with a 50% decrease in power, this is no longer true. On its own, xenon poisoning would not cause a catastrophe, as it merely slows down the nuclear reaction. However, it will play a role in the events that are yet to come. At 11:10 p.m., the operators are given permission to continue shutting down the reactor. At this point, Reactor 4 is now in the hands of the less experienced night crew, which, according to some accounts, never received proper instructions to carry out this test. 33-year-old Alexander Akimov takes over as the Unit 4 shift chief leader in charge. The previous shift chief, Yuri Tregub, is free to leave, but he decides to stay to help with the experiment. The power level of the core is now at around 20%. So far, everything seems to be going smoothly. The reactor is placed on auto control to keep the power level steady. All of a sudden, the power plummets to 1%. Something is wrong. This is the result of the xenon poisoning mentioned earlier, which is absorbing the neutrons and slowing down the reaction. Akimov relays the issue to Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov. Akimov suggests that they abort the test. The reactor is just too unstable. However, Dyatlov, feeling pressure to carry out this experiment, insists that they continue. After all, the next opportunity will not be for another year. Failure is not an option. Senior engineer Leonid Toptunov overhears the conversation. He sides with his colleague Akimov. Together, they try to convince Dyatlov to shut it down, but Dyatlov lays down an ultimatum. If they do not comply with his orders, he will personally see to it that they are replaced. End of conversation. Akimov and Toptunov relent. Against all safety precautions, the engineers withdraw nearly all of the control rods in an effort to bring the reactor back to power. Additionally, emergency safety measures are disabled to prevent them from interfering with the experiment. The power of the reactor begins to rise. The power of the core is up to 7%, but it will not go any higher. Xenon poisoning has seen to that. The flow of water is now being controlled manually, which is extremely difficult as a small temperature change can cause a large power fluctuation. The reactor is getting more unstable. Valery Pervezhenko is the reactor section foreman. He sees the 350 kilogram fuel caps jumping up and down in their sockets from built-up pressure in the reactor. He runs towards the control room to warn his colleagues. At 1:23 in the morning, the experiment finally begins. It lasts a total of 40 seconds. During this time, water in the nuclear reactor boils. Boiling water is less effective at absorbing neutrons, and the power in the nuclear reactor begins to increase. Akimov pushes the emergency shutoff button AZ5, which lowers all the control rods back into the reactor. In theory, this sounds like a great idea, as it should seriously slow down the chain reaction. Except it has a design flaw. As the rods are inserted, they displace the neutron-absorbing water below them. Additionally, the tips of the rods are made of graphite, which actually increases the nuclear reaction speed. To make matters worse, the neutron-absorbing xenon gas, which had been suppressing the nuclear reaction, has been rapidly burning off as power in the reactor increases. At this point, there is almost nothing holding back the nuclear reaction. As the pressure increases, the fuel rods rupture, causing the control rods to get stuck with their graphite tips still inside the reactor. Within 4 seconds, the power in the reactor surges to an estimated 20 times the maximum output. The exact amount will never be known, as recording instruments have been destroyed by this point. At 1:23 and 44 seconds in the morning, the reactor explodes. The intense pressure caused by the steam ruptures the reactor, flinging the 1,000-ton lid through the roof. The release of radiation begins. The surrounding air glows blue as neutrons ionize the air. This is known as Chernobyl radiation. At the time of the explosion, 35-year-old engineer Valery Kodmachuk is manning the circulating pump engine room. He's killed immediately by the blast, becoming the first casualty of this Chernobyl incident. Shortly after the explosion, Valery Pervezhenko, the foreman who witnessed the reactor caps jumping up and down and the explosion, arrives at the control room. He reports his findings to Dyatlov, but Dyatlov doesn't believe that the core is destroyed. Akimov also has trouble believing that the reactor is destroyed. After all, they have been told that RMBK reactors cannot explode. Pervezhenko leaves the control room and checks the radiation levels with a dosimeter, before going to search for Kodmachuk. During his search, he navigates through radioactive rubble, which emits over 10,000 roentgens per hour. It is here that he receives a lethal dose of radiation. Meanwhile, Dyatlov sends 2 junior technicians, Alexander Kudryatsev and Viktor Poskeryakov, to the reactor to manually lower the presumably seized control rods. In reality, the reactor and the control rods have been destroyed. As the two make their way towards the reactor, they run into Alexander Yevchenko. At the time of the blast, Alexander Yevchenko was in his office between reactors 3 and 4. After the explosion, he checked on the damage and was horrified to see a major chunk of the building missing. Afterwards, he encounters Pervezhenko, who is vomiting and losing consciousness, but details of their interaction are not well documented. Eventually, he runs into the 2 junior technicians on their way to the reactor. Despite Yevchenko's explanation that there are no control rods left, the men decide to continue anyways. Yevchenko, knowing the full extent of the danger, makes the decision to accompany them. The entrance to the reactor room is blocked by a heavy steel door. Yevchenko forces it open and holds it ajar while Kudryatsev and Poskeryakov enter to check on the control rods. Confronted with the open flames of the exposed reactor, the skin on their faces quickly darkens, resembling a sunburn. Kudryatsev and Poskeryakov are only inside the reactor room for a minute, but within that time, both receive a fatal dose of radiation. Along with Perevchenko, these 3 men will be the first to succumb to the effects of Chernobyl radiation at the Moscow hospital soon after. Yevchenko will survive, but not without serious health complications, including radiation burns on the left side of his body from holding open the door. Firefighters arrive on scene. Some of them pick up radioactive graphite in their hands, curious and unaware of the danger. Up until now, Dyatlov has been underplaying the explosion to authorities, claiming that the reactor is still intact. However, by 5 o'clock in the morning, he begins to fall ill from radiation sickness after receiving a dose of 390 rem, which kills about 50% of people. He is taken to a hospital and survives. Later, he will be sentenced to 10 years in prison for his actions. At this point, Akimov still thinks the reactor core is intact. Believing that coolant water may be obstructed in a closed valve somewhere in the plant, he and Toptonov, along with a couple other men, make their way into the water room. They spend hours turning valves in an effort to cool a non-existing reactor, while wading through a knee-deep mixture of radioactive fuel and water. As time passes, they begin to feel weak and have trouble turning the valves. By 6 o'clock in the morning, Akimov is falling ill from radiation exposure. During their time in the water room, both Akimov and Toptonov receive a lethal dose of radiation. The accounts I covered are just a small portion of what occurred at Chernobyl. Many more men risked and lost their lives, and there's much more complexity to the events that occurred than what I covered here. I do want to mention that I have a second channel called Aimlessly Educated, which contains some more lighthearted content. There isn't much to see on it yet, but I do plan to have better content on there soon. Chernobyl is a very fascinating yet very heavy topic, and it took me many hours to put this video together. If you'd like to support this channel, just simply leave a like and comment below if you have a suggestion for a future video. Thanks for watching.